Welcome to the June 14th, 2022 meeting of the Public Works Committee. Call the meeting to order and welcome both members of the public, staff, and council members. Our committee members are Councilmember Barbara Haynes-Burke, Vice Chair, Councilmember John Larson, Councilmember Annette Scipio, and myself, Jeff McIntosh. The City Council meeting to include adopting the 2022-2023 budget will be on Tuesday, June 21st at 7 p.m. in the council chambers. This is a day later than normal due to the celebration of Juneteenth. There will be no City Council or committee meetings in the month of July. Okay, tonight, as usual, we have both consent agenda items and general agenda items. We have 3 on the consent agenda and 3 on the general. Are there any items that committee members or council members would like pulled and discussed from the consent agenda? If not, I would entertain a motion to approve.
I move for approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
Thank you. Please vote. Great, thank you. Now, on to general agenda item G1. City Clerk.
Item G1, Winston-Salem Transit Authority Services Update.
We have Ms. Woodson to give us a report.
Good evening, Public Works Committee.
Good evening.
I would like to thank you, first of all, for having me tonight and just let you know it is a pleasure to see you all this evening. I have not seen you face-to-face in several months, so it is a pleasure. On tonight, I will be presenting the update for the Winston-Salem Transit Authority. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. The first slide before you this evening is the fixed route ridership. As everyone is aware, we are still in the midst of our COVID, and I wanted to present and provide to you all a brief overview of the route ridership per route, the monthly ridership per route for the pre-COVID, the peak, and what we consider now as our new norm. So basically, this slide displays by our 31 routes, each one in a ranking. And you'll see to the far right of each column, the ranks from 1 to 31. The one would the one would indicate the route that had the least amount of changes in the ridership. So that's the most efficient route, so to speak. So we didn't lose as much ridership in Route 86 as we did in say Route 97, because it's ranked at 22. So that's kind of how this slide presents itself. So as you can see from the ranking, the Route 86 is the route that had the least effect to it, and then it goes on to show where the other routes are in ranking as well. And with Route 100, of course, being the route that was the most, that took the most impact, had the most impact to the ridership overall. And this next slide is got just a graph of some of the same information, but in an annual yearly summary of the overall ridership, compiled all of the routes together. So we wanted to do a 13-month overview. So this is from April of 2021 through April 2022. And as you can see, we took a major hit in January of 2022, and that was the contributing factor to that. It was the winter months. We lost some days of service where we normally would operate, but we had to close due to the ice and the snow routes. I mean, the snow and rain and those factors, and then the holidays in itself. Those are the reasons why we took that major hit, because we actually closed for services. And then a couple of Sundays we opened later when it was lighter outside, and we were able to clear some of the streets and the transit facilities so that we can operate in a more safe manner. Moving right along to the next slide, we have the TransAid, which is our elderly and disabled transportation, and kind of the same scenario or of information on a month-to-month basis. We show our ridership per month. This also displays the passenger count and the total trips that were taken in the months of January 2021 through April of 2022. And then at the bottom, it shows a display of the passengers per day. And that's an average for the month. So the average of passengers per day for the month of January 2021 was 389 for January 2021. And the average amount of trips taken was 341. The ridership for the past year, as you can see, we also had that same type of dip in our ridership for January in our Trans-Aid department as well. With the weather, even on some of the days where we didn't have as much bad weather, some of our Trans-Aid passengers were not able to take the trip, so they were canceled, and that displays the reason why we have a dip in that month as well. This next slide shows the accident history for our fixed route preventable accidents. You'll see indicated in red how many accidents we had for the fixed route that actually we found when we do our investigations that the operator or the employee could have done something, did something that could have been prevented that would have not caused us to be in an accident. So each accident is rated, whether it's preventable or non-preventable, and the discipline goes along with that. And the green actually shows where someone hit us, and we could not have done anything to avoid that accident. This is the Trans-Aid accidents within the past year. The same scenario, as you can see, we had less accidents in our paratransit department than we did the fixed route. And accidents as far as maintenance is concerned was almost non-existent. So we did not, and we do have maintenance employees that drive as well when they go make bus exchanges or repairs on the street and testing brakes and things of that nature. So they're out in service as well. So they're rated on the accidents also. As far as our customer service call center for our mobility management department, this slide just shows the amount of incoming calls that are received into the transportation center for various reasons, scheduling, looking for bus routes, complaints, concerns, anything of that nature. So from on a monthly basis, this is how many calls come into the call center. This slide is, we actually rate our performance as it relates to the drivers and the on-time performance, et cetera. We also rate our performance of our mobility management customer service department as to how many calls they actually answer and respond to our callers. So this shows the percentage, and they remain favorable to our performance standards as it relates to answering the calls. This next slide is just to give you all an overview of some of the challenges that I'm sure that you all know that we're facing, but it's not unique to WISTA. It's all over with staff shortages. So we have been heavily affected by that as well. And I won't read the slide verbatim, but just the fact that the CARES Act was a fund that we were able to use for hiring and different things that we needed that were a reflection of the COVID, the coronavirus, and it was a response and relief and to prepare to help us in the future. So some of the funding we utilized to help with our hiring practices by offering bonuses for sign-on bonuses for employees that are interested in working for WISTA, and that was for any department, not just related to the drivers. Also, we had in September 20 of 2021, we had to suspend 13 of our routes due to the fact that we did not have enough drivers, and we were constantly not able to perform the routes that were scheduled to do so. So we had to make a drastic change. So we advertised and we had to reduce those services, suspend them temporarily. And we're currently still running off of the temporarily reduced services with a plan to try to bring that service back to the street. Excuse me. before September of 2022. That is our hope. One of the ways we're targeting that is we've increased our hiring by having more hiring classes. We relax some of the standards by trying to help and offer classes to most of our drivers. When they're coming in, they have to actually have their permit, their CDL permit, and then we will train them to get their license. But we actually started about 3 months ago, where we'll offer to assistance even with helping to get their permit. That can go either way. So we did not find it was majorly beneficial, but it did help a couple people to obtain their permits, and they remain with us today. So those are some of the things, the campaigns, and then we also have a referral bonus. So any employee that refers a candidate to come to WISTA, and that employee is hired and they stay on with us for a certain amount of time, the employee that referred them will get a bonus as well. This slide shows just a snapshot of the classes that we hired. And I actually wanted to put this on here too, because when you hire, that doesn't mean you're going to retain. We lose a lot of people in the hiring process in itself by hiring them by the time they have to go through and get their physicals, drug screens, and different things of that, and then the background checks to make sure that they're safe to be employees. We lose a lot of people in that phase of the hiring, and then before the day one, if we hire 15, we may end up with 7. That's kind of been the standard. So this is just to show you how many were hired and then how many actually showed up for the first day of class. This, the middle section, the middle graph actually shows you how many actually were able to receive the $1,000 bonus, or a portion of it to date in each department. So we've had 9 in fixed route, 3 transaid, 2 in mobility management. At the time of this, no one in maintenance, but now we have had a recipient of the bonus in maintenance. So to date, we've actually used about $7,500 in the bonus, sign-on bonus campaign. The last, the final graph here shows the referral bonus as well, as how many employees actually referred someone, and they did stay for the first 6 months, so they were a recipient of that. The bus shelter phase. So the phase 1, I think in 2020, we were working with the phase 1, and those shelters were put up and installed at their various locations. And this is another list since the last time we met that have been completed to your left. And on the right, these are the shelter installation locations that are pending. So we're working on those. And what I didn't put in the presentation, but I will just make a note, we also have bus artwork that's going up all around. Hopefully you all have been able to see that. So we're in the second phase of that as well. So not only do we want to install shelters, we want to beautify them. We want to make them look good, make them presentable, in hopes that people will be more comfortable and have something to look at when they're waiting for the bus inside the shelters. So when I speak on the ridership and you see the reduction in ridership, I know that is something that a lot of us are paying attention to with the ridership and how it's dropping, and looking at ways to recover ridership and those things. Well, we have hired and have a study going on for the WISTA services, and HDR is the firm that was hired to present and do this study, and it is on the way. They've already started implementation of that. It is our hope that in our next update that we will have them to be able to present more of the deliverables out of this study. And some of the things outside of what I've identified in the slides that we're looking for is recommendations on how we can make our service more efficient, whether that looks like an increase in frequency, which we know would help our service, eliminated some areas that we have really severely low ridership in and repurposing it. If microtransit would be an option, that would help us to make sure that our service meets the needs of people that is not in the community that we're not reaching now. So these are some of the conversations that we're having with HDR and that have been designed in the scope of work that they're going to help us to deliver. So thus far, on May 12th, HDR team, along with the WISTA and DOT staff, had teams that went out, and what they did was they did window surveys and ride-alongs. So they actually rode the heavier ridership routes as well as the lower performing routes. And they were teamed up and they rode those routes individually, doing observations, observing the location, observing the shelter, observing whether or not we have a trash can, whether we need a trash can, looking at the different amenities that we actually currently have and looking at opportunities where we need to implement. So, and then just looking at the ridership, the boardings and the deboardings, just going and taking pictures. So that's a part of the process. So this study is really in depth, and we look for a lot of data to come out of it to help us with the future services of WISTA. So as I stated, we're looking at some of the deliverables as far as where they suggest that we add stops, remove stops, add service stops, add service or remove service or repurpose services. We also have asked for a policy as it relates to standards. And what that means is right now we get a lot of recommendations for bus stops, shelters, removals, relocation, and it's so inconsistent, but we continue to get those requests. So what we've asked them to do is to look at other services and other providers to see what their service standards look like and recommend a service standard that we could follow, and then everyone could be educated on, so we'll all be on the same page and we'll have something to guide us. So when we get those requests, we won't put a shelter up today and then 2 months later someone says, no, that's blocking my driveway or that's an inconvenience. I don't want the bus on my street. We need something to go by. And that way, that's what we've asked, and we're looking forward to getting that sooner rather than later. So that will be one of the deliverables that'll be in the first task that we'll receive from HDR. Some of the next steps for the study would include surveys. They're surveying not only the public, our current riders, potential riders, but they're also surveying the dispatchers and the drivers, the first responders. These are the people that actually know what they drive these routes every day. So we need to listen to them as well. All of the different stakeholders, they will have a part in this survey approach. We also have public meetings and give the public opportunity to state what they would like to see the service look like and concerns that they have with the existing services, requests, and all of that data will be gathered throughout the survey process. So the existing conditions and demand analysis, which is one of the deliverables, we anticipate that being completed by July 31st. So again, we prepare to have that for the next update. And the remaining task after the next steps would be the demand analysis report, the engagement plan, the service improvement recommendations, and the master document plan that would be at our disposal for now and forever. We anticipate the tentative project completion date would be August the 1st, 2023. So it's a long time coming, but it's a long time for us to gather a lot of data that makes sense and look at trends over time. We have a lot of data to compare with pre-COVID, peak COVID, the new norm, the expectations, the efficiencies, and things that they recommend before we make another change to our service. And that is the presentation itself, and I'll entertain any questions if you have any.
Thank you. Before we go to questions, I want to thank Ms. Woodson for her typical thorough and informative report. You give us a lot of data and analysis, and we really appreciate just the level of information that you give us, so thank you very much. I did want to offer an opportunity for Mr. Robert Garcia, the board chair of WISTA, to stand up and make any remarks that he'd care to. Don't want to put you on the spot, but did you want to come to the microphone and add anything? You don't have to. Good.
The one thing I'd like to add, and thank you for allowing me to, is just the job. My part of WISTA has been for about 18 years on the board and many years as board chair. And just the work that we do there at WISTA, Ms. Woodson, of course, taking over for Mr. Barnes, has done a remarkable job. And through the Business 40 renovations, through COVID and so forth, and the challenges that come with it, I think they've done a very, very good job of it. And thanks, Mr. Garrity, and all the city council people that we work with. It's a tough ride sometimes, and sometimes we get hit with a lot of different questions, you know, about empty buses or bus routes or how much it costs. And but we service the city very well, and we're very proud of it. And I'm just very proud to be a part of it. And I'm just a small part of it. But just I wanted to pay them the respect that they deserve. And thank y'all for.
Thank you for what you're doing. I appreciate it. So with that said, if we'll take, Ms. Woodson will take some questions from council and committee. Mr. Larson first.
I don't really have a comment. I'm amazed at the number of phone calls you respond to in a given month. I mean, I had no idea that your communication system was that overwhelmed. And I would like to compliment you, Ms. Woodson, for your thoroughness of this report. It's always impressive. The graphs and the database is very convincing and a great overview. But the thing I walk away with is you answer the phone a whole lot. So thank you for that.
Thank you. We have a team of 10 individuals that take those calls.
Yeah, really.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Councilmember Scipio?
Thank you, Ms. Woodson, for a good report. I just want to let you know that the shelters are looking really good. When I drive around the ward and I look at them, and I take such pride in knowing that those shelters are there and they look good. And the ones with the art are amazing, just absolutely stunning. And it really speaks to that project being so well done. I appreciate it, though I'm not a constant bus rider, but with gas going up 5 gallons, I think all of us should consider riding the bus. If the bus pass for the month, is it still around $30 for seniors or something? Yes. Okay, I can afford that. But I do have a question. I don't know if you know it. You should, I think you were here, your report mentioned that with COVID, we suspended 12 routes because lack of drivers.
Yes, 13 routes with lack of drivers, yes, ma'am.
Were those routes low-performing routes, lower than route number 100?
No, not lower than Route 100, definitely not. They were the lowest performing, most of them were the lowest performing routes, but we also took into consideration routes that provided service to the hospitals and different things that people need, you know, grocery and not so much retail, but grocery, hospitals, and things of that nature, and the low ridership on the routes. And we also targeted the PM shift, so I may make that clear. It was in the evening. We did not remove any service to the daytime routes outside of Route 100. That ends at 3:30, but everything else starts, the suspension was after 7 p.m. during the time that we have less ridership overall.
But the study that you're undertaking might reconsider those routes coming back if they.
Well, we're going to bring those routes back regardless. Once we have enough staff, we have another class. We have candidates that are actually that's in the process now of training. So once they are released from training and back into revenue service, and then we have another class that's going to start July 18th. So we're targeting fixed routes because that's what we suspended the service. So all of that's in an effort to make sure that we have enough drivers to bring that service back. So we will look at bringing that back hopefully before September. And then at the end of this study, it may be that some of those routes may be presented as routes that we can potentially reduce or repurpose during more peak time of the day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Councilmember Mundy.
Thank you again. I'll echo the thanks to the committee for this report, and it's very thorough and a lot of data. My first comment is actually to Mr. Garcia to say, it's good to see you after 15 or 20 years, and it took me a while to make the connection. And your graphs of when we dipped and when we peaked. You explained the dip in January, but I noticed a peak in March for both regular bus routes and TransAid. Is there any particular reason for a peak in March?
The only thing that we can contribute that to is the amount of days that we would have service, because, we have, like February, the different months that we have holidays and we don't run service. And then when it starts getting warm, people start riding. So the ridership tends to, increase more around March, April, and that time
So
frame.
just a little spring fever.
Spring, people getting out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I very much look forward to the HDR study. I don't envy the task. It's a very capital-intensive business that you're in, and the decisions that get made affect the riders' lives like almost no others. Where they live, what jobs they can hold, all those things are affected by how long it takes to get the bus to, from where you live to where you're going. And it's not easy to move routes without affecting people.
Exactly.
So that's something that I know will be very carefully considered. I do appreciate the fact that we're looking at alternative strategies as far as the types of equipment that we operate. Something that I've talked about forever is that transportation and housing are fit hand in glove, and the more that we can do to build housing around existing bus routes, the better off our utilization will be, the more our cost per rider will drop, and the better off people will be who need that service. And I want to examine how much we can get away from the hub and spoke way that we do business and more to point. So those are all things that I'll be looking forward to hearing coming out of the HDR study. So I'm very much looking forward to that. I don't envy your task.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. If there's
Thank
nothing
you. All
else.
have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, if we could have G2, please.
Item G2, information on building and fire codes pertaining to the Winston Weaver Fertilizer plant.
Good afternoon, Chairman McIntosh and committee members. I'll kind of tee this up. So what we have for you, as you know, we've been kind of doing a little bit of a investigative series as a follow-up to the Weaver Fertilizer fire. Take that off. And so at each Public Works Committee, we've kind of tackled a different topic, whether it be planning and zoning or environmental or air quality. What we've got for you tonight is building code and fire code, and I want to kind of draw the distinction. We will have Chief Mayo or his designee back at a future meeting to talk about fire response and the events of that evening and the methodology that went into that. That's kind of not what's here for you tonight. What's here for you tonight are really our building code and fire code, how that relates to the Weaver Fertilizer plant, some of the considerations to think about as we think about those specific disciplines. So just want to kind of draw that distinction, and here to present this information tonight, we've got Tracy Phillips, who's our chief building official, and Mike Morton, who is our deputy fire marshal. So without further ado, I will turn it over to those gentlemen, whoever wants to lead us off here, and we'll get started.
Thank you.
Thank you, ACM King. Appreciate that.
Good evening.
Chairperson McIntosh, council members, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight and to share information with you regarding the very topic that ACM King just mentioned, code enforcement as it relates to the Weaver Fertilizer fire. Again, my name is Mike Morton. I currently serve as a deputy fire marshal with the Winston-Salem Fire Department. And here with me this evening, Tracy Phillips, chief building official, as you've already heard. So with that being said, Tracy, would you like to start?
Sure. It's good to see you. Councilmember McIntosh, Councilmember Burke, Councilmember Scipio, Councilmember Larson, Councilmember Mundy. To start with on this first slide, to put this first slide in perspective, we know the fertilizer plant was built in 1939. Assuming that this was built under the 1936 code, to keep it in perspective, the 1936 codes covered many codes that had 130 pages. Today's code, just building alone, has 700, and then there's, as we'll see in another slide, there's multiple different codes that we have to deal with for that. The next slide is our permit history that we have on record. As you can see, we've had heating and air changeouts. panel changeouts and panel additions and sewer pipe that has been put in, that has been permitted and inspected and completed and approved. With that, I'm going to turn this one over to Mike.
I'll slide back for a moment and point out, if I can. The bottom of that slide, you notice that between the years of 2005 and 2022, our fire department's fire code inspectors performed 17 fire code compliance inspections at the Weaver Fertilizer site. 17 years of records is a lot. I didn't want to overwhelm you with information this evening. So we brought up the last 6 years to give you a sense of exactly what kind of things we saw during those visits. You can see in the last 2 years before the fire, our inspectors found no violations whatsoever. And prior to that, the violations you see listed are pretty typical to ones that we might see throughout the city at any of our commercial or multifamily residential occupancies. So nothing particularly unusual. You'll also notice that each of the issues that were found were also corrected on a fairly timely basis.
So on this slide, you can see these are the codes that I referenced before, how many we have today versus what we had at that time, with all the different trades that we have.
So given those codes that Tracy just mentioned, it then often gets asked, what can we build at a particular site, and how do we build it? In terms of our codes, building, fire, and the other technical codes, we're prescriptive codes in a general sense. Rather than telling someone what they can do in a place, our codes say how they should do it. And those codes have various requirements that are based upon certain categories that we look at when we analyze a particular project. You see on the slideshow there, a couple of those categories are mentioned, like occupancy classification, locations of fire-rated separations. Those are all very technical terms. To make it a bit easier, here are the kind of questions that we ask ourselves when we look at these kind of projects. How will a building be used? How large is that particular building in both area and in height? How is that building divided up into separate fire areas? How many people is that building designed to hold, and does it have adequate exits for all those? And what systems, processes, and operations will occur in the building? Now, when it comes to building a new building or to adding on to an existing building, how we find these things out, of course, through the plan submittals that we look at.
So with this, our process comes in, the architect or engineer draws those plans for us. They go through plan review. These areas may have, these projects may have areas in them, what we call contain areas or control areas. And whichever, the way our codes are, if we go into Weaver and they want to add a room or whichever, that code would be today's code, whatever we do today throughout, because it's a change of use or it's an addition or a remodel or such. But the previous part of the buildings does not apply. It stays under that particular 36 code if that's what it is.
So as Tracy's just mentioned, when we have new construction or additions, we go through this process. Once that process is complete, they have their plans reviewed and approved, they get their permit, they pass their inspections, and then they get their certificate of occupancy. Realistically, our friends in building, electrical, mechanical, and plumbing don't go back out to that unless they do other work there. Now the responsibility falls upon the fire codes inspectors. And what we look at isn't necessarily the construction of the building, other than just to make sure it's still intact. What we're looking for is to make sure that those fire-rated separations are still present, that the life safety systems such as fire alarms and sprinkler systems are still working, that extinguishers and such are still in place, that occupants can still get out of the building, and that the operations that go on within that building are still safe and per code requirements. Now, the number of times that we visit those locations and the schedule is based upon what the state tells us we have to do. And we've also enacted that in ordinance here. So now that we've talked a bit about that entire process, we thought about a few questions that you may have related to both the Weaver Fertilizer Fire and to what might come next for similar projects or for other development in the city. One question we thought you might have is, what happens if we want to see additional requirements beyond what the codes already have added to those codes? So there are realistically two methods for doing that. The first of those is to get the code amended itself. And so the codes are enacted and adopted by the North Carolina Building Code Council. If for some reason we feel that there's a change needed to those codes, that we're not protecting ourselves the way we should, we can suggest amendments that the Building Code Council can take up and put those in place in the code to be considered throughout the entire state. There's also an option to have a local ordinance that allows us to have more stringent requirements and regulations. But even with that, that ordinance would still have to go to the Building Code Council because it involves the building, fire codes and such, so that they can consider it and make sure it doesn't overstep the bounds that are allowed by the state. We also thought that you may have questions about whether or not we could make construction and design requirements of the codes retroactive. As Tracy mentioned earlier with Weaver Fertilizer, that building was built under a previous code. And until they modify the building or add on to the building, it exists under that code. Really, the state's current codes don't allow for us to do any kind of retroactive activity. They stick by those codes. And so that would take, again, an amendment to the Building Code Council. We also thought that you might have questions about materials that are stored in areas other than buildings, specifically things like rail cars and vehicles. I mention that because of the Weaver Fertilizer incident. Everybody's heard the numbers, of course, about how much ammonium nitrate was stored on site. A large amount of the ammonium nitrate was not in the building. Instead, it was in the rail car out back. And our codes don't have any say on transportation vehicles. So we have no say whatsoever in what goes on within those vehicles, even if they're parked, even if they're positioned permanently. We thought you might also have some specific questions about materials, such as the materials that we saw at the Weaver Fertilizer site. And so to give you a general sense of how complex our codes are, we brought along this wonderful document from the Building and Fire Code. This is an example of one of the several tables that Tracy and I and others have to look at whenever somebody's dealing with hazardous materials to figure out how much they can have in a space before enhanced regulations and requirements are in place. This is one of about 6 tables specific to general storage and use. There are also specific tables in the codes about individual materials. So it's hard for us to answer in a general sense when certain things are required. And that's the reason why the information detailed in plans is so important, so we can get a better understanding of exactly what needs to be covered in the codes. Since we're talking a bit about the Weaver Fertilizer incident, we also thought it might be important to recall some previous incidents. Specifically here, I've referenced something from the West Texas fertilizer incident. After that incident occurred, the advisory board that investigated that incident offered some suggestions to the International Code Council. That's the folks who initially come up with our codes on how they should possibly change the building and fire code to make these facilities more safe and the public more safe. Now, they're great suggestions, but they have not been adopted by North Carolina in current codes. And if they were adopted today, they would only apply to anything built after this date. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. We'll be glad to entertain whatever questions you might have.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I got questions from committee or council. I know everybody's brain is hurting from all that information.
Yeah.
But any questions? Councilmember Mundy.
Who could make those retroactive? Could that be done at the state General Assembly level, or if we can't do it locally, could any body of legislators do that?
Councilmember Mundy, that would be something for the Building Code Council to take up. They could consider amendments to the code, whether generally speaking throughout all the codes or to specific requirements or specific facilities. But that would be a decision for them to make.
Thank you.
Councilmember Larson.
I have some recollection that there's a threshold that is applied when you are retrofitting a building that if you expend so much money on a building that you have to bring entirely up to code. Is there some, am I remembering correctly that there's certain levels of general maintenance and improvements you can make, but if you go so far that you have to then bring the whole space up to code requirement?
Councilmember Larson, yes and no. The yes part of it, there is something wrote somewhere, I can't tell you exactly where it is now, there's a certain percentage that we get to. I've heard 50%, I've heard 75%. The no part is we fall back into the retroactive part. Let me use a house as an example. So you have a rent house and part of it's burnt. Let's say 50% of it's burnt, but 50% of it's salvageable. The 50% that's salvageable, we have no control over that unless you start tearing it apart. So it's a yes and no question. It's kind of hard to answer. Some jurisdictions, they do that, some don't. And then actually in this one, we don't unless there's a reason. What has made it that way? That's a hard question to answer.
So it's a difficult question. If you're reinvesting in an old building and you're trying to upgrade it to certain levels, but maybe not a complete retrofit, if you kick into the point where you have to then bring it up to code is really the question. And how much can you do without actually forcing the issue of having to bring it all the way up to code requirements?
You could have almost a 90% construction. I'll use my house as an example. 2 years ago, I pretty much gutted my house except for 3 walls. Those 3 walls we didn't touch. We didn't have to because they were still partially code compliant. So as I said, that's kind of a hard piece, and it depends on the state that the house is in. We have a lot of rent houses that are in shapes like that, and we try to do our best to add what we can.
Yeah, I was really thinking about more commercial and public properties.
Commercial's another funny one. We don't really have anything for that can make us go in and do so much.
Okay, interesting.
Councilmember Scipio.
This is so interesting because if I'm hearing you right, we are subject to regulations that we don't control, but they're dictated by the state. And so though people may believe that we should be able to do things, we just don't, we can't do that. Our hands are pretty much tied. But those state regulations have proven to be very good, I suspect, on going there, probably more stringent in some things than we would want to have. So I certainly understand that, and thank you for making us aware of that. My question is, when it comes to commercial properties, manufacturing properties, do you have a regulation that says you must investigate them or inspect them on a certain frequency? And if there's a frequency, what would that be? Or is that dependent upon what the business is?
Councilmember Scipio, your last part of that question hit directly on point. The use of the occupancy controls how often that we have to come back and inspect it. That can range anywhere from twice a year for public schools to once every 3 years. The fire code and its structure attempt to structure that in a way that allows us to come into occupancies more frequently based upon the hazard. But those hazard categories are very generalized. Yes, that frequency is controlled by the use of that particular facility.
So I do know that there are inspections of, say, our high-rise apartments like Sunrise Towers or Crystal Towers, those high-rise. So how often do you have to inspect those?
For a high-rise residential occupancy, that would be once per year.
Once a year?
Yes, ma'am.
And so I think it's really interesting that in your inspections, no violations were recorded or noted over the last 2 years for this particular facility.
That's correct, ma'am.
Gentlemen, thank you. This is a very technical issue. I think you guys did a great job laying it out. I've got a question that you may want to steer away from after you hear me ask it, but we've talked about the inability of municipalities to change the grandfathering and some of the fire code. Can you talk a little bit about why that is, why it's so difficult to change things at the state level?
You want to start on that one?
And remember, we only have about 2 hours.
Chairperson McIntosh, to be honest, I can't speak for the state, obviously, but my thought is that because we have statewide codes, they want to make sure that the requirements that they set forth work throughout all the 100 counties and throughout every jurisdiction. And obviously, that can be complicated because the issues and problems that we have in a location like Winston-Salem may not necessarily be the same as in a very rural space within the state. So I think that there's some element of that in the way that the codes are crafted.
And I'm going to opine here a little bit, but so I think the battle that goes on largely is between the insurance industry, which wants things as tight as possible, and the manufacturers, industrial producers, real estate lobby that wants things as loose as possible. So I think you have this constant tension, which creates very little change.
And the makeup of the Building Code Council is represented by those same fields and those same professionals,
Right.
which means that sometimes change in that council can be difficult to accomplish.
I don't know if we know this answer off the top of our heads, but can we look at what changes can be made in a local bill? Is there anything that we've heard tonight that would allow us to strengthen some of our things that we can locally, given the constraints and the parameters that we know are out there from the state?
By Constitution, North Carolina Constitution, there are certain things that cannot be addressed in a local bill, and I suspect that this is one of those areas, but I'll be happy to look at it and get back with the committee.
Wouldn't be surprised if that's the answer, but, okay, anything else from, yes,
Just
Councilman.
one quick question. Changing of owners of a building or changing the purpose without actually adding on to it or anything, does that change the codes? Do they have to bring it up to code, or is that irrelevant?
That is another one of those iffy questions. So if you go to a business that was a salon, now it's going to be mercantile, then yes, that may pull in some extra issues like bathrooms, may need more bathrooms, may need more handicap accessible. So yes, in a sense, and it could, in some instances, may require, if it's hazardous, and we have had that would pull in sprinklers. We just did some evaluations the other week. They changed the purpose of the building. That pulled in the sprinkler part of it. So yes.
But if the purpose stays the same and it just goes to a new owner?
Then that's then it could stay like it was.
Okay, thank you.
And I will say that there was a very long protracted discussion between staff and fire department and inspections and the commercial realtors group about change of use. And I think it was handled very well. I think both sides came out of it thinking that we had a better set of codes than we did previously. So it was kind of hit or miss before, but I think generally everybody is pleased with that process now. All right, gentlemen, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
We may call you back for further questions. All right, now if we can get to G3, our final item.
Item G3, information on ordinance amending chapters 5 and 11 of the Unified Development Ordinance to add use-specific standards for chemical manufacturing and battery manufacturing.
And this evening to speak on that, we have Mr. Smotherman. Thank you, Steve, for enlightening us.
Here we go. Okay. Thank you, Chairman McIntosh and Vice Chair Burke and other council members for having me this evening. As you know, back in April, we presented to you how we currently regulate chemical manufacturing and how some of our peer cities do it. I'm going to give a real brief summary of kind of refresh everybody. And at that meeting, you said, well, please move forward with a draft text UDO code amendment regarding that. So we did that. We looked at ways that we could reduce the possible harmful impacts of chemical manufacturing to surrounding areas. the potential of chemical manufacturing to degrade nearby air and water quality, and what mitigation measures can be taken. As I mentioned, we were already working on an assessment of how we deal with fertilizer plants when the committee asked us to take a look at it. And we looked at the other cities in North Carolina, those being Charlotte, Durham, Fayetteville, and Greensboro and Raleigh. Our current regulations are that fertilizer plants are classified as a chemical manufacturing based on the North American Industrial Classification System, or we call it NAICS. And that chemical manufacturing is one of 13 uses that are classified as manufacturing C, and they're only allowed in the general industrial zoning district, which is the most intensive district that we have on the books. Any use involving manufacture of hazardous materials are prohibited right now within 1 mile of Salem Lake because of watershed protection regulations. And looking at the peer cities, we've found similar results that fertilizer plants were only allowed in the most intensive industrial district, and that was usually classified as some form of chemical or high impact or hazardous manufacturing. And these communities had various additional restrictions that range from special use permit approval to enhanced setbacks from residential areas to perimeter security wall fences, hazardous materials management plan, and water supply watershed restrictions. And I'm not going to go over this table, but this was from April. You can look at the details of that to see how each community does it. As a result of looking at that and your directive to come up with a draft text amendment, we have proposed the following use-specific standards, and they will apply to chemical and battery manufacturing uses within manufacturing C. And one that's not listed in our table, but it's very related, is explosives manufacturing, and that is considered a subset of chemical manufacturing. So if anybody came in wanting to do that, they would have to follow whatever guidelines are adopted as well. Again, they would be permitted only in the general industrial district. The approval process, what we're suggesting is that it requires approval of a special use zoning district, RMSS, GI-S, not a general use rezoning or limited use. And that requiring that means they have to come in with a site-specific site plan, and that those conditions on that site plan would be tied to approval of the rezoning request.
And Steve, can you remind us what public hearings that would require from an applicant?
Excuse me?
Would you remind us what public hearings that would necessitate if you were applying for one of those permits?
It would be, going before. Now, this is different from a special use permit. You don't have to make the 4 findings of fact.
Okay.
This is legislative, so it means that, as you know, with those special use, with the S added on the request, they usually have a site plan. If they're apartments, usually have elevations. Whatever we think is important to be addressed should be shown on the site plan, and they will be tied to whatever is shown or notes are attached to that site plan. So we think that gives council the greatest leeway in reviewing these requests.
So if somebody wanted to, say, start a new one, they would come to staff and they would get feedback from staff. Staff obviously probably knows the direction of council on it, so they would get advice at that point. Then they would go before the planning board.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then they would come before council.
Yes.
Planning board would offer an opinion on whether or not it met UDO and other restrictions.
Correct.
So we would get that body that would review it.
Correct.
There would be public comment
Correct.
during that as well.
Correct. So I think all of you are familiar with this. The rezoning requests have -S on the end of them.
This is for the hundreds of people that are watching on TV.
Yeah. So, yes. So we think that gives you the most latitude in reviewing, and also can tie down a lot of stipulations that way.
Thank you.
The other requirement is that would require compliance with all applicable local, state, and federal laws. And we were, part of the zoning, I was suggesting, I think it's required anyways by the fire department, but that a hazardous materials management plan be submitted as part of the plan review process prior to obtaining a building permit. So that clears that up. The next standard would be that it would be prohibited entirely from water supply watersheds, not just within a mile, but entirely. And so it would not be allowed anywhere within the watershed for Salem Lake. Let me go down to the next one, is that we trying to come up with a reasonable safety distance. We decided on a minimum perimeter setback of 400 feet and a perimeter, but and to do that, I mean, that 400-foot perimeter setback, if you had exactly 25 acres, that perimeter setback occupies 14 of those 25 acres. Because essentially the 400 becomes it's on all four sides. So it's 800 squared.
So your facility, your manufacturing facility or storage facility could not be within 400 feet of any perimeter point.
That's correct.
On that 25 acres.
That's correct.
Thank you.
But to make sure they have some reasonable use of the property, we're saying that parking areas only, not loading and unloading areas for trucks or any activities, but parking areas could be located as close up to 200 feet of the perimeter. So that allows the calculations for this area, assuming you have a perfectly square lot, which is not the case, but with the 400-foot perimeter setback, you would have a little over 10 acres, which would be about 40% of the property that could be developed with facilities. And with the parking, it would allow up to 80%. So, and again, to accommodate that, rather than just leave it with the setbacks, we are suggesting a minimum site size, so no one's fooled by the setbacks of 25 acres. Again, that would leave about 11 acres for a buildable area.
Right, thank you.
And then lastly, the last couple items would be a minimum 6-foot high security fence or wall that would be opaque. To enclose all the facilities from exterior property lines. That is more to keep people out from trying to get in. Hopefully they wouldn't get in there, but that's to provide security so they wouldn't break into place. And the last is that because of the significant perimeter setbacks, we're saying the standard buffer yard provisions would still apply, but we would say that any street yard landscaping be located outside of the security wall or fence rather than inside, so there could be for everyone to see. So what you may not see is there's not an enhanced setback or specific use separation from residential zoning districts. That's still something to consider, but we do not recommend one because we have a lot of standards that are proposed with this amendment. If somebody can meet all of that, and say we had a 1,000-foot separation from a residential zoning district, if one located hypothetically and was operating, and 6 or 10 years pass, and somebody approves a rezoning for a residential district that's 800 feet away, then that chemical manufacturing plant is then rendered nonconforming. And if it becomes nonconforming, then the expansion of that nonconforming use is limited to 25%. So my point is, if somebody can meet all these requirements, particularly 25 acres and the large perimeter setback, I don't think we want to penalize them down the road for something that was not a result of their own action. So with that, I'll just sum it up real quick. These are all the conditions on one page. Permitted only in general industrial district, requires approval of a special use zoning district, compliance with all applicable local, state, and federal laws, prohibited water supply watersheds, minimum site size of 25 acres, perimeter setbacks 400 feet for operations, 200 feet for parking, minimum 6-foot-high security wall or fence, and street yard landscaping be located outside the wall or fence. And I'll try to answer. A lot of you have some deep questions, so I'll try our best.
Thank you, Steve. Do I have questions from committee? Councilmember Scipio.
Yes. I know Douglas Battery closed its manufacturing. Do we have battery manufacturing in the city currently? Or did that just close down all of their
The
manufacturing?
General Assembly no longer allows us to require businesses to have a privilege license. We really don't know who does business in our city, unfortunately.
All right, so my first question then is,
Nothing.
we don't know.
We don't know.
Okay, we don't know. And I think my other question has to deal with the severity that we're looking for with these setbacks, the 200 feet, 400 feet. They're very severe versus other cities of 20 to 50. So it's almost that we're saying we don't want this industries in our community, given those severe setbacks. But I certainly understand why we're going that direction. But my other question has to do with the watershed. It says here, prohibited in water supply watersheds. Do we consider all of the creeks that run through the city part of our watershed supply?
It has to be designated by the state.
Okay.
And as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, Salem Lake is designated.
It's the
So
watershed.
Any
Anything that.
drainage basins that drains into Salem Lake is in that watershed.
So Brushy Fork Creek might be in
Might be, yeah.
because it goes in there. But
If it
the
drains-
creeks that got polluted at Weaver, would they be protected by this ordinance or not?
No.
So if not, I think we might need to put something in to protect the creeks. Because I think that it flowed down to the Yadkin.
Yep, so Councilmember Scipio, you're probably thinking of Mill Creek and Monarchus Creek were the two that were
Yeah.
directly impacted by Weaver. So as Steve kind of mentioned, we carved out sort of the water supply watershed. So if you think of Salem Lake, you kind of draw a larger boundary that kind of spans around up towards Walkertown and to Kernersville and back around, and that's the basin that drains to the lake where we get our water from. We drink that water. Those creeks that we're talking about over there don't feed directly into Salem Lake. And so we've got a large portion of Winston-Salem that's not within a water supply watershed.
But I do know that the utilities takes a lot of water out of Yadkin
They do. as
and
you-
treats it.
Yep, they do. So ultimately, you'll remember, as Keith Huff pointed out during his presentation, basically our intake for the Yadkin is much further south. It's almost towards the county line at Davidson is where we pull that water from. So if you remember kind of Keith's diagram, that water made its way into the Yadkin, but it came into the Yadkin below where we pull our water from. That's how we were able to very confidently assure our citizens their water was not polluted. Thinking about how we sort of layer on regulations for all the creeks and streams in Winston-Salem, that's a whole big can of worms that probably is a separate discussion apart from this.
But I'm really concerned about making sure we don't have any kind of manufacturing that has the potential to contaminate any of our streams, our water, because the animals actually are affected, maybe not all the human beings, but the other forest animals. So that's my concern.
Yeah, I don't think that fits within the scope of this ordinance change, but it's something that we definitely can consider and talk about down the road. Any other comments or questions from committee or council?
Some
All
of
right,
that might be addressed by the stormwater management regulations, wouldn't it? So,
Maybe we can have stormwater come back to us and tell us what the current regs are. Can I get a sense from committee about further action on this? Do we want to see this come back to us in the form of an ordinance change? I'm seeing nods, seeing yeses. So I would like to direct staff to bring this back to us in the form of an ordinance change. at first available committee meeting. This will come back to us first to look at that? Is that, or would we go straight to council?
Mr. Chairman,
Should come back to this committee.
Yes, Ms. Larson.
at some point, I would like to sort of build on that CPO, Councilmember CPO's question about watershed. And, we have other lakes and we have other recreational areas that people are actually engaging the water, creeks and what have you. And I'm wondering if we're selling ourselves short here if we don't recognize the potential for contamination that would be detriment to the human beings that recreate around some of these streams and lakes.
I think we need to get this one done, and then we go back and look at that, because what we're talking about is a different issue that may already be dealt with by some of our stormwater controls.
So maybe we can, if we're just talking about batteries, if we're just talking about battery plants and fertilizer plants, that's true. But they could be built on something besides a watershed. And anyway, maybe it is another discussion, but from an environmental issue, I would think if we're looking at the bigger picture, I would like some thought given to.
So those are questions that can be asked during a special use.
Possibly.
So I think we have protections in that regard. Again, we can look into that further, but I do want to make sure this comes back to us as quickly as possible so we can act on this. And if we need to go further, that's fine, but I don't want to hold this up for the other. Yes, Councilmember Scipio.
I do have another concern, and what really happened at Weaver was a neighborhood got built around it. And if we approve someone to build and have a manufacturing site, then in our zoning and other planning, we must protect that business as well as encourage other development. I don't think it's fair to approve a neighborhood to be built where it makes the manufacturing non-compliant. So it's probably not in this ordinance, but if we could say something like neighborhoods, approved neighborhoods have to be outside of that boundary where the manufacturing is, so you don't create a problem.
I hear what you're saying, and we can take a look at that, but I think the main thing is just being aware of rezoning cases, and that staff and others, if there is a battery or chemical manufacturing and there is a residential request, we'll have to try to point that out at the time of the rezoning.
And I think that's why we all make the big money, is to represent our constituents when those kind of cases come up, and to have a voice during rezoning issues that come before council. So that's our opportunity to weigh in on those kinds of decisions, because obviously none of us are going to be really in favor of a high-density multifamily being built right on the boundary of this, but that's kind of
Trying to put that
our
on.
job and what we have to do.
Permits for individual homes could get to be very, very sticky because of the number of permits that we issue for single-family homes.
Okay, thank you. I think we've spoken as a committee. We appreciate your work. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Any other business to come before Public Works? Very good, okay. We stand adjourned, and we will see you in August.
In August.
No, we'll see you next.